Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, 10 incredible facts about the Challenger disaster. And just before we get started, I do want to say I've recently started a new channel. It's called Biographics, where we look at biographies, probably could have guessed that from the name, of notable people from history as well as the present day. We've got loads of people on there, like Vladimir Putin, the Queen of England, other people as well. We got people like Elon Musk coming up, Richard Branson, loads of great stuff. That's Biographics. You can find a link to it in the description below, and I'd love it if you subscribed. Alright, let's get into it. At 5 p.m. on January the 28th, 1986, President Ronald Reagan delayed his State of the Union address to give a heartfelt speech on the Challenger shuttle disaster. He had insisted that newcomer Penny Noonan write it. Reagan believed that he should impress upon the audience, particularly children, that such painful things were part of the process of exploration and discovery. He went on to invoke the legacy of explorer Francis Drake and concluded by saying that the nation would never forget seeing the 5 crew members, the engineer and the teacher, whom he dubbed the Challenger 7, as they slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. It was one of the most important speeches in modern American history. With that in mind, let's remind ourselves a bit about this terrible tragedy. Number 10. It ended the civilian space program. Today, we mostly associate civilians going into space with private companies like SpaceX or Virgin Galactic. This has led many to view the fact elementary school teacher Krista McAuliffe's inclusion so that she could teach a live broadcast lesson to classrooms nationwide was a mere stunt. The truth of the situation was that plans for a first civilian had already been made back in the 1970s. When McAuliffe was selected from among 11,146 applicants to be the first civilian in space, there were already plans to follow up on the historic flight with the first journalist in space. No less than Tom Wolfe and Walter Cronkite were considered for the ride, even though Cronkite was already 69 years old at that time. Even after the Challenger disaster, plans continued to get a civilian into space for a while. A dogged Cronkite was so undeterred that he managed to reach the top 40 semi-finalists, effectively as far as anyone in the program got. It wasn't until July 1986, about 6 months after the tragedy, that the idea was put on indefinite hold. This is except for the case of Barbara Morgan, a second-grade teacher who trained simultaneously with McAuliffe in case she was unable to ride on the day of the launch. She continued training for years after, and in 2007 she had the thrill of a lifetime when she rode with mission STS-118. When she was in space, she gave a lesson on how plants grow in space. Number 9. Soviet response. The cultural memory of American relations with the USSR is that the countries were so at each other's throats that the disaster was a perfect excuse for Soviet propaganda to gloat. What could be a more convincing case that Americans were mishandling their space programs during a heated period of the space race? But the Soviet media instead treated it as a horrifying shock. The New York Times reported that, if anything, the average person in Moscow was surprised that there was no ejection system for a shuttle built in a country as advanced as America. Indeed, the airing of the footage was accompanied by mournful Glenn Miller music in a show of solidarity, and Soviet cosmonauts sent a telegram directly to NASA expressing their condolences. Despite all this, as BBC Russia representative Famil Ismailov reported, by the anniversary of the events in 2016, Russian state media did not publish any memorials or even mentions of it, and it wasn't a topic of conversation. In his opinion, at least, that said more about the mood of the country in 2016 than it did in the sincerity of the Russian people at the time. Number 8. Settlement. In 1988, 4 of the families of the disaster reached a settlement with Morton Thoyacol, the manufacturer that was judged at fault for the mechanical failure. The 4 in question were the families of Francis Scobie, Ellison S. Onizuka, Gregory P. Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. It had been Leo B. Lind Jr., the law partner of McAuliffe's husband Steve, who had represented them. The total settlement among the 10 people was $7.7 million, which as of August 2017 was the equivalent of $16.3 million. At the time, attorney Ronald Christ, who'd successfully represented the families of the 1967 Apollo shuttle disaster, said that the payout was woefully inaccurate and that the families should have accepted a settlement of nothing less than $20 million. They simply desired to be done with the process, and while that's completely understandable. Number 7. Last words. In 2001, a purported transcript of the last words of the Challenger crew circulated online. It included such dramatic comments as one of the male members reassuring the others that they had to think positive and that it'll be just like a ditch landing when the shuttle was approaching the water. The final words of the transcript were the touchstone biblical verse, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Snopes.com eventually reported that what had been fooling the internet was actually from a 1991 Weekly World News article that was a heinous hoax. The truth of what the doomed astronaut said was much more mundane and yet oddly incongruent. Initially, NASA reported that the last recorded words were Commander Francis Scobie saying, "Roger, go at throttle up." Later analysis of the tape indicated that the real last words were the pilot, Michael J. Smith, saying, "Uh-oh." It was a poignant reminder that these were unsuspecting people in the situation, not over-the-top characters. Number 6. 10 years of parts. Although the main areas of the crashed remains of the shuttle were located within a day, it took a month and a half of salvaging operations in order to retrieve most of the wreckage, and it was near the end that the crew cabin with the deceased inside was found. Since the Challenger shuttle was composed of well over 5,000 parts and weighed more than 250,000 pounds, parts from the vessel washed up on Cape Canaveral and Florida beaches for years after. The most dramatic delayed finding was in 1996 when an 8-foot-long and 13-foot-wide section of wing washed up on Cocoa Beach. It was discovered by a pair of fishermen. The pieces were in good condition despite being encrusted with barnacles. Bruce Jarvis, father of crew member Gregory Jarvis, said that each story of recovered material was like somebody picking at a scab for him. Number 5. It did not explode. Despite the common impression one might get that the shuttle exploded in mid-air, the truth was more that the shuttle came apart. Indeed, observers on the ground noted that instead of a massive explosion, the end of the Challenger's ascension was marked by the sound of the main engines coming to a stop. Booster rockets continued to fly upwards after the rest of the rocket collapsed. There were inevitably explosions after the fact, but these were individual parts making contact with the ground and not the overall vehicle. This myth was certainly not helped by the fact that documentaries made after the fact dubbed in an explosion sound effect. Classy. Number 4. The consciousness debate. Considering that the crew cabin was salvaged intact as a result of the shuttle falling apart instead of exploding, the grim question many people began to ask was whether the people trapped inside the shuttle had suffered physically and how aware they were of their impending deaths. It was initially hypothesized that the changes in cabin pressure and increased Gs would have, relatively mercifully, ended the crew's lives immediately. Analysis of the wreckage found that 3 of the astronauts had the time and presence of mind to open their air packs. Michael J. Smith's was still mounted on the seat behind him, meaning a crew member not only opened theirs, but was able to activate his. This indicated that there was not an immediate drop in pressure, which would have knocked the crew out in seconds. So they would have indeed had time to see their cabin tilting down towards the ground, and they could have potentially survived to be killed on impact with the water. It serves as a vivid reminder that all future expeditions into space should take all extra precautions they can to ensure nothing like this happens again. Number 3. The engineer who anticipated it and blamed himself. Bob Eberling was the leader and organizer of a group of 5 engineers who foresaw the lethal disaster coming, so much so that the group tried to convince NASA to cancel the launch. Eberling also told his wife that the shuttle would blow up the next day. 3 weeks into the investigation, he was one of the 2 engineers that anonymously informed National Public Radio of their attempt to have the launch cancelled. It wasn't until 2016 that Eberling identified himself to NPR's listeners, along with his colleague Roger Boisjoy. Although he did what most people would consider enough, the very religious man was hard on himself for the next 30 years. After the event, he went into a depression, which eventually compelled him to retire. There was a silver lining to this story, though. After National Public Radio broadcast his interview, there was an outpouring of support from listeners for Eberling. He received numerous phone calls and letters, one of the more notable ones coming from his superior, Alan MacDonald. He reminded him that Eberling had been one of the people who had gone beyond the call of duty. Eberling's wife, Kathy, told NPR that these messages had significantly lifted her husband's spirits. Number 2. Beyoncé's sample. In one of the most questionable moments of alleged attempted tributes in popular culture, Beyoncé decided to sample part of the news coverage provided by NASA Public Relations Officer Steve Nesbitt for her 2013 song XO. The sample was, "Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation, obviously a major malfunction." To put this at the beginning of a love song instead of any sort of memorial for the event was inevitably seen as an extremely distasteful joke, a sentiment that was barely changed by Beyoncé's statements after the fact that she meant for the song to help to heal. Not that any of the controversy prevented the song from going gold, though. Number 1. Richard Feynman's demonstration. In by far the most famous bit of forensic work after the explosion, Caltech physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman demonstrated in 1986 that the O-rings used to connect the solid fuel rocket boosters weren't properly sealing. He demonstrated this by dunking one of them in a glass of cold water and showing the press that it had lost all elasticity. As he explained, on the night before the launch, temperatures had reached freezing. Unlike prior test launches, NASA hadn't had time to test how well the equipment equipment would function under freezing conditions because they were operating under an overly tight schedule as dictated by the government. Feynman's discovery did not come easily. It spent a long time testing whether fuel turbine blades were at fault for the critical failure. It wasn't until NASA released photos that revealed a leak in one of the boosters that he began looking in the right direction. It's also worth noting that at this time he was battling the cancer that would end his life in 1988. He passed away before NASA was able to launch another shuttle. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also check out some of our videos from the archives over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.